Hi, this is Pastor Michael from Southside Baptist Church here with our Sunday night Bible study. We're moving tonight into the 39th chapter of the book of Psalms. We only have 13 verses in this chapter, so this shouldn't take us very long to get through this. Psalm 39, just to give you a little bit of an overview of this psalm. Psalm 39 can be considered a lament psalm, as so many of them are, as we've gone through so far, but it's a lament that was almost not given. David's going to explain here, as we're going to read, some realities that had discouraged him from speaking truthfully about his problems. But then we're going to see him overcoming that as he considers how temporary this life truly is. Something that we all really can afford to see more of. Amen. From there, he eventually launches into his lament, in which he reflects on how his sin has resulted in unpleasant circumstances in his life. Then David finishes in a fairly melancholy way, asking God to give him some amount of joy before he dies. That's pretty much Psalm 39 in a nutshell. When we look at the superscription, which comes before verse 1, to the chief musician, even to Jeduthun, a psalm of David. Jeduthun was the name of a Levite whom David appointed to lead one of the temple choirs. So David is writing this psalm for the chief musician. In this case, this man named Jeduthun, spelled Jeduthun. That's what we gather from this superscription leading into our psalms. Now, David begins the body of this psalm by rehearsing something that happened to him historically, as we see in verse 1. David says, I said, I will take heed to my ways, that I sin not with my tongue. I will keep my mouth with a bridle, while the wicked is before me. Take heed and keep are both the same word in Hebrew. So David is emphasizing his silence. At some point in the past, he determined that he would be silent. Why? Well, he was concerned that he might sin with his tongue. That was a great concern of his. We all know how easy that is to do. Amen. The tongue is a fire, the Bible tells us. The very world of iniquity. If anyone doesn't sin with his tongue or his mouth, then he's to be considered a perfect man. And I don't think any of us are. So David's concern seems to be a very legitimate concern. And he also tells us the kind of person that he especially didn't want to sin with his tongue in front of. And it was the wicked. Why do you think that was? Well, we all know that that's like. Which one of us wants to make mistakes, even sinful statements in front of a lost person? We're trying to win them to Christ. That is what we are commanded to do. So I think we all tend to be pretty careful about what we say when they're around, but more importantly, we have to be even more careful about what we allow ourselves to think and to dwell on. Because the more we think about it and dwell on it, the better chance is we're going to say something that's going to reflect what we're thinking about, what we're dwelling on. We'll see later on in the development of this psalm that David really wanted to issue a lament, but he felt that would be inappropriate to do in front of what he would consider wicked people. Why is that? Well, you and I have seen David's lament psalms. We've been through quite a few of them, and sometimes we can be almost shocked at how he complains to the Lord, almost whining to the Lord. Sometimes he complains even about the Lord, and that's not typically the message we want lost people to hear. is it? You might know what it's like to be going through some kind of tremendous personal upheaval in your life that is a direct result of how God is treating you as His child. As a lost person, simply would not understand any of that. In fact, if they knew of your bitter complaints about how God is dealing with you, you're afraid that they might have even more reason to reject the Lord. And we don't want to, we're accountable for that, so we have to be careful. But then the lost loved one or friend comes up to us in the middle of our struggling and says, how are you feeling? And you want to pour out your bitterness and your complaints to them, but you know they would have no ability to comprehend the true nature of the struggles that you're going through. I think that's David's concern here. He's struggling with God and would give his lament, and yet he doesn't want to make God look bad. None of us should. I think his concerns are appropriate. They're appropriate concerns. His heart is in the right place, evidently, but it's not easy to refrain from issuing your laments about life. No matter how hard you try, as we see David relating his experience with trying to keep silent, moving into verse 2. Verse 2 says, I was dumb with silence. I held my peace even from good. So he was able to do this, to keep quiet in front of the wicked, even when he felt like he needed to express the great difficulties that he was going through. And what happened? Well, we look at the end of verse 2. And my sorrow was stirred. Sorrow is also translated as grief or pain. So he is now incredibly grieved and with having to keep in his complaints. And it gets worse for David in verse 3. My heart was hot within me while I was musing the fire burned. So he's mulling over all these difficulties that he's having. He's thinking about them and bonding and brooding over them. And he feels restrained from speaking of them to the Lord because he doesn't want to make the Lord look bad in front of lost people. And we also need to have that concern that we don't want to make ourselves look bad in front of the lost people. But our first concern should be not to cast a bad impression of God himself. But as he does this, it feels like a fire inside of him is burning. His heart is hot, he says. He can't hold this any longer. And so he finally speaks, and as he admits at the end of verse 3, then I spake with my tongue. And so the following is what he ended up saying with the Lord. And the first thing that David requested of the Lord is that God would help him to remember how temporary both he and the wicked men whom he was concerned about really are. Lord, make me to know mine end and the measure of my days, what it is that I may know how frail I am. That was verse 4. The word know is used twice in this verse, as you can see. So David is wanting God to impart knowledge to him. And the knowledge that he's looking for has to do with his own mortality. He wants God to keep before his eyes the fact that he will someday die. And he's asking God to help him remember that he is weak and that he is needy. And then it seems as if the first part of the next verse, David has indeed come to know these realities. Verse 5 says, behold, thou hast made my days as a handbreadth, and mine age is as nothing before me. So David understands these things. He knows that his days are like a handbreadth, the distance from one side of your hand to the other. So if we're talking about length, how long is that? Somewhere between 2 and 4 inches, we could estimate. That's not very much. So that's how David perceives his life. In light of eternity, a person's life is too short. This is what David wanted to be reminded of. And it's what God apparently did remind him of in light of his prayer in verse 4. So that's David looking forward. He wants to know that the days he has left are few. But he also wants to look back and see how brief his life has been thus far. He's come to realize that his age and the life that he's lived out thus far are nothing in God's sight. For a being who is eternal and has always been and always will be, you can imagine that the age of even the oldest living person in the world is unimpressive to God. And we might tend to think that these details are morbid. We might try to actually avoid these realities and try to keep them out of our mind. But David here wants to ponder them. He wants to consider them. And it's not simply that David wants to know his own temporary nature, but we see him start here at the end of verse 5 to consider the fact that everybody is like this. Verily, every man and his best state is altogether vanity. Selah. Literally, surely all breath, all breathe, all men standing, man, even those who stand strong and mighty, are merely a breath, a vapor that passes away. And apparently David at this point, after the beginning of the psalm in which he was so overly concerned to keep his emotions hidden from wicked people, is now starting to wonder how important it really is that he tries to make himself look good in front of them. After all, these guys of David himself are all just going to pass away rather quickly. Why be so concerned about what others think about you when both you and they are so temporary? And why be so concerned about what the wicked think about God if what you're saying is truth? That's, I think, what David delves into now as we look at verse 6. Surely every man walketh in a vain shoe, surely they are disquieted in vain. He heapeth up riches, and knoweth not who shall gather them. Now the word surely and vain here appear 3 times in this one psalm, verses 5 and 6 and 11. In verses 5 and 11, the phrase every man also appears in the Hebrew, and even though the phrase every man shows up in verse 6 in the King James Version, in Hebrew it's simply man. So 3 times in this psalm, David is having to remind himself that man, or every man, even is empty in vain and is a vapor that passes away. And these were the very men that he was so concerned about not offending. He was so concerned that the wicked ones among these men would take the opportunity to impugn God's character based on the truth that David was wanting to speak. Well, we're going to have to stop right here, folks. I apologize. Once again, my phone is about to die on me. My lack of planning ahead. I apologize. We will try to get this finished up during the day tomorrow sometime, probably tomorrow afternoon. We'll be beginning back with verse, let's see, we stopped at verse 6. So we'll finish up talking about verse 6 and then move into starting at verse 7 and move our way through verse 13. So I do want to thank you all for being with me tonight. I'm sorry we didn't get through the whole psalm, but we'll get it finished up tomorrow. And maybe next time I can remember to charge my phone. Just been a very busy afternoon. Right after church, we got very busy here at home. Had to go take care of some things, and been on the road most of the afternoon, and got home and had to try to get this done. And so I apologize for not being more prepared and having my phone more charged up. So that's my fault. But thank you so much for joining me. And thank you for sitting in for this first half of this Bible study. We'll get it continued tomorrow. God bless each and every one of you, and have a blessed evening.